Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, patient advocate Donna Cryer, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 2 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now. I am recording this introduction on Wednesday morning. We originally taped on Tuesday. During yesterday's recording session, my online connection faded in and out during the first half hour and then dropped entirely. Stephen stepped in to do a fantastic job as emergency co-host. After this introduction, you will hear most of the original session. I will come back on at the end. Apologies in advance if my sound during this introduction sounds a little different than the podcast. A couple of differences between this format and our usually weekly session, to which we will return next week, I hope. One, there is no formal icebreaker in the form of an opening best thing that happened in the past week question. I faded in and out during that. 2, since the session was designed as a part 2 to last week's part 1, I start out by reviewing what we discussed about COVID last week, followed by 2 important pieces of COVID-19 news that happened between last week's recording and now. 3, originally we were to discuss an idea I raised last week about compassionate use protocols. I fell off the podcast before we could raise it. We will add it to an appropriate discussion in the future. 4, finally, it's worth noting how much has happened in the U.S. since we taped the previous episode on January 4th. This episode discusses no current U.S. politics, which was our conscious choice, given that a discussion of COVID-19 and fatty liver disease deals with 2 pandemics that should rise above partisan political issues. One more thing before we start. Please listen to my comments at the end of the episode for information about our new social media accounts and new ways to reach us. With that, let's join the episode in progress. We're taping this on Tuesday this week, which means it's been 8 days since we recorded last week's episode, and a lot's going on in the U.S., to say the least. We're not going to talk about any of that today, but I kind of feel we need to acknowledge that it's been an interesting week for all of us. Just real quickly, as of this moment, last week's episode is the 3rd or 4th most downloaded episode in the history of this podcast. I hope it gave everyone something interesting to think about, maybe a place to clear your minds and think forward. We have Stephen, Louise, and Manal back this week. We have a tremendous amount of ground to cover, so we're actually going to skip the groundbreaker and dive right in to the session. Since this session is an impromptu sequel to last week's, I wanted to step back a little bit and just talk about what did we do last week, right? What we discussed were a range of issues surrounding COVID-19 and fatty liver in the year 2021, British variant, coming of vaccines in the US and the UK and how best to deploy them, and the physical and emotional wear and tear the pandemic has taken and continues to take on the frontline healthcare professionals who treat it. And at the end, we wound up discussing 2 big ideas we got excited about that emerged from the conversation. One being a thought from Stephen that we could place FibroScans and Piccolo machines at vaccine centers so that the patient could receive information not only get vaccinated, but also could be evaluated for fatty liver disease, and if in fact they appeared to have enough of a problem, that they could be educated, offered a FibroScan, and then pushed directly into treatment while they're educated about what the relationship between fatty liver and COVID-19 might be. I then asked whether, if given the importance of defatting the liver for treating patients with COVID, did it make sense for some company with an excellent defatting medication in late stage to think about offering it as a compassionate use protocol, and what would it take to do that? So based on that, we decided that what we were going to do was we were going to come back this week, throw out a few more big ideas, and see what we could come up with that might be an exciting or promising thing to work on. And since then, the biggest COVID news has come on 2 fronts. Number one, the vaccine dosing. The U.S. government has announced in the last 2 days, it'll be 4 days by the time this gets to you, that they're not going to be holding back as many vaccine doses as they were. The original plan was to hold back 55%. Vaccine doses are going to get pushed out a lot faster, even if it means eventually there might not be enough second doses to go around. Now, that might make sense for reasons that we discussed last week. The Dr. Walensky's Health Affairs paper that talked about the easiest way to limit deaths, or the more likely way to limit death in the next 6 months. But it comes against a backdrop where some states are getting no more than 15 to 20% of the vaccines available to them actually into people's arms. So getting vaccines out will be important, getting it out more predictably will be important, but we've then got to do a better job of accessing patients. That was number one. Number two, The Lancet published a 6-month look back at 1,733 patients from Wuhan, China, evaluated from June 16th to September 3rd of this year. It's a big paper, but across all groups, here are some key findings. 63% of all patients were still exhibiting fatigue or muscle weakness, 26% sleep difficulties, 23% anxiety or depression. Or the issues were a lot more severe for patients with a severity rating of 5 or 6 on their disease versus 3 or 4. The odds ratio for a patient of severity 5-6 versus 3 was 4.6 in terms of having issues with pulmonary diffusion. The odds ratio was 1.77 for depression, 2.69% for fatigue or muscle weakness. And the upshot is that severe patients are likely to experience significant post-disease effects 6 months after they finish acute treatment, and particularly the pulmonary effects and abnormal pulmonary scans are important and noteworthy. This ties neatly back to everything we were talking about trying to educate people who've got fatty liver disease about the impact of fatty liver disease on severity of COVID infection should you have one, and maybe that would be a motivator to treat. So with that as a start, first of all, let me just say hi to everybody. Stephen, hi. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Alive here in San Antonio, certainly in the middle of all that's going on here in the U.S. and with the pandemic, but healthy, 9 days post-vaccine, doing well, and glad to be here today to discuss these issues in further detail.
Good for you. Louise, hey, how are you?
Fine. Well over here. I don't think I've ever watched so much CNN with what's going on with you guys, but interesting times.
Yeah, they are. Manal, welcome back.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, it is certainly interesting times. Been a challenging week for me on the COVID front, I must say. Professionally, lost 2 patients, and personally, son of a friend of a family. So for the first time in this epidemic, it's touched me closer than it has in the 9 months past, but I have felt it this week.
You know, you're one of, I think, 5 or 6 people I know well who has said that to me about the last week. It's just been a tough week on COVID front as well as everything else. I'm sorry to hear all that. Sympathies to you and to everybody involved. With that, we're diving in on the subject of interesting and large ideas that might improve COVID treatment and prognosis for fatty liver patients in 2021. And what I'd like to do first, just take 3 or 4 minutes, describe your idea, discuss the specific liver problem related to COVID, if there is one, that it's intended to address. And to the degree that you're comfortable, what do you see as issues and challenges in implementing the idea that you're laying out? And if anybody wants to go first, great. If not, we can go back to Stephen. If you've got the idea that you started on last week, we can go back to that one first. Okay, go ahead, Manal.
So, I started off saying, boy, this has been a tough week because I've come close to losing 2 patients as well as being touched closer as far as family and friends with this. But, it got my wheels turning because in the midst of caring for my patient, I was able to use telehealth to remote video right into his hospital room in his local facility, which was 2 to 3 hours away from our tertiary care center here at Duke, and to have a face-to-face with his doctors there who were at his bedside as well as his family. And it really put things into perspective as to how I deliver liver-related consultative care in a totally different way than I have historically done throughout the entire course of my career. And that being able to render care, and not just in a clinical capacity, but as we talk about evolving science and access to the absolutely needed therapies for our patients with NAFLD-NASH and advanced liver disease in particular, and to do so using different platforms. And one of the thoughts that crossed my mind was, my gosh, I don't have my patient here, but I wish I could have been more accessible. And the thought of being more accessible is this framework of institutional-centered care and institutional-centered care for the delivery of clinical research may need to change as we develop new constructs. And Roger, you used the word re-engineer, and I thought that was a fabulous way of phrasing a different construct. And one of the fleeting visions I had, and I don't think this is new, I believe there was somebody in California that may have had a similar idea, is, as I was thinking about NAFLD and NASH and defatting the liver, this image of a van with a FibroScan in the back and a Piccolo blood test machine and a coordinator and me, and the thought of de-liver came to my vision plastered on the side of the van, where I could go around and visit patients in their own space, render a FibroScan to those at risk who have diabetes or obesity or who I know may have elevated liver enzymes, and take clinical care effectively to the patient, potentially in the road, but you really don't need very much if you're otherwise equipped. And much of what we use, especially as the technologies have become smaller, are portable. Consenting's portable, personnel are portable, FibroScan machines now are in the size of a handheld briefcase, and it is possible able to reach the patient if the patient can't reach us. Because what brought this to light for me is in trying to care for my patients, and I don't think this is new news, but, the hospital operator would say, well, we're on divert. The hospital is full. The clinic is socially distanced and we have density control for COVID safety measures. No, you can't add that additional patient. We're at maximal capacity. These are messages that are resonating because right now we are so busy caring for our COVID patients that the access that we had for caring for less acute chronic disease has changed. And there is this element of patients who have chronic disease states who are older than the age of 65, which is very common for our patients who have NAFLD and NASH, and who are diabetic, have a fear of seeking care for non-urgent matters while they are chronic, certainly, and do pose future risk, but they're not posing a risk to them today, and they're not posing a risk to them now. And so there is a sense of hesitancy and reluctancy to come to a large tertiary care center to seek care for their fatty liver disease. And so as I was reflecting on this, the construct of, do they really need to come to me? Can I go to them, whether it be virtually, rechange the platform for which I deliver clinical research, maybe on a virtual platform, maybe more ability to consent on a virtual platform, obtain screening metrics in the absence of them having to come to a site, maybe a very quick lab and lead visit, maybe a portable FibroScan that is able to meet the patient outside the constructs of a big tertiary care center. The way I practice here might be very different than Stephen's model for practicing, but it is harder for patients to get in and out of a big institution. And I think raised some very innovative approaches to how we can potentially do clinical research and render chronic care to patients with liver disease in the era of COVID. And I think the era of COVID is going to implement changes to the field of medicine, some of which will likely be here to stay, and not necessarily a bad thing either. The delivery of telehealth, new constructs of cost effectiveness in doing business for caring for patients with chronic diseases, and reassessing and re-equilibrating our healthcare utilization and resource utilization for higher acuity.
So, Manal, thanks. That's a great answer and a great way to kick us off. So, Stephen, how would you make use of that kind of thing? Does it make sense to you? What would you do with it?
So I think it's a fantastic idea. This notion to deliver healthcare, as a hepatologist to our patients, I think is fantastic. And we have the technology to do that. I was taking my daughter, my senior in high school, on a tour of TCU and SMU yesterday, and I was struck by these little mini vans that they had. They were facility vans that they were able to drive around campus, through campus. They're smaller than cars, but they were able to drive on sidewalks and that sort of thing. I mean, we don't need something that small. We can use just a regular van. But this notion of carrying a portable FibroScan, an imaging device, it doesn't have to be a FibroScan. It can be any portable imaging device that can evaluate for both liver fat and for potentially stiffness. I think marrying that up with a chemical analyzer like the Piccolo, and there's a lot of them out there. That particular one is made by Abbott. We're able to do real-time, in the field, chemical analysis by assessing liver-associated enzymes and imaging of the liver to tell us, is there a go, no-go? Is there a problem? Is there not a problem? And remember, the most useful way to apply a FibroScan is for its negative predictive value. And we know that 80% of fatty liver patients are unlikely to develop a liver-related complication. They're still at risk of metabolic syndrome, diabetes, this, that, and the other. But at least from a liver disease perspective, we can give them reassurance that today their liver is not significantly impacted by fatty liver. However, we can then go on to provide appropriate guidance in the form of counseling relative to diet and lifestyle, and the need to potentially follow up with their PCP to address their comorbid conditions. But we've made that assessment in the field in a real-time situation. Now, the flip side of that is, let's say we have a positive test. We have an abnormal set of liver-associated enzymes. Again, to Manal's point, potentially we're able to, at a minimum, provide education. But we could go beyond that and even provide consultation as to ways to address further workup and evaluation. And that's the 80% solution to this entire problem. Taking it one step further and linking it back into my thought from last week, imagine having that portable van at a COVID vaccination site. So one of the nice caveats there is we know fatty liver patients are increased risk for COVID, and patients to a large extent, or maybe not to a large extent, they may be aware of this. They may not be aware of this, but that becomes an educational point as well. Just because you've been vaccinated today does not mean you can't get COVID tomorrow, right? So you still have to be vigilant. We still want to provide care for the comorbid conditions that exist concomitantly in the era of COVID. And so we can provide that opportunity to scan their liver at the time they're there for their vaccine. Now, I know since the last time we talked, we have opened up a large vaccination site at the Wonderland Mall of Americas here in San Antonio on Fredericksburg Road for those over 65 or with significant comorbidities. Well, who has bad NASH? Over 65 for sure, and those with significant comorbidities. So, how cool would that be? These patients wait in line for 3 to 4 hours for a vaccine. Well, what else are they doing? They're sitting around talking on their phone or reading something on their smartphone. Why not step over and get your FibroScan done and potentially your AST and ALT checked? And, the nice thing about the Piccolos is there's 16 different panels. You can do an HbA1c there as well. The results come back in 10 to 15 minutes while you're still waiting in line for your COVID vaccine. And then remember, you got to wait 15 minutes after the COVID vaccine before you can go. And if you've had a prior issue with reaction, you have to wait 30 minutes. So I think it's a great opportunity. How we would affect that, I think, is the issue, because there's certainly cost involved with renting a van, with getting a FibroScan, getting the Piccolo, getting the cartridges for the Piccolo, making sure you have the right team members in place to do the scan, to interpret the scan, and provide, follow-up care as necessary. But, from a conceptual point of view, it seems doable. So to Manal's point, in summary, I think it's fantastic. Where could it be implemented? I think straight away, potentially at some of these COVID vaccination sites. And this isn't limited to the U.S. I think, Louise, you've got 1,000 vaccination centers being set up in the U.K. And I think also you were talking before the podcast about some of the populations that don't normally come to healthcare to be treated, but would in fact potentially show up for a vaccine. So these are the people that live on the fringes of society that may be at even greater risk for NASH. So I don't know if you wanted to take the ball from me and run with it on what you were thinking there, but I think it's a fantastic opportunity as well.
Yeah, I think I love what Manal said. I can see these, maybe it's just my extravagant mind, these mini robots round the wards, and on the front of them is a screen, and your consultant rounds will be purely on the robot to some extent, with some doctors going round and the nurses. And therefore you can be, as you were saying earlier, in any location providing highly expert care. We now have surgery that can be done from one side of the world when they're operating on a patient in another side because of the touch techniques. So the technology is there to be able to share that skill. And for me, having lived in Australia for a while and still sort of commuting backwards and forwards when I get the opportunity, it's about remoteness. A lot of patients, particularly in Australia and a lot of the regional areas, I should imagine, of the US, have to travel to get expert care. And I think what you suggested earlier is very exciting. The experts can be there with the physicians. It's teaching, it's talking to the patients, it's education of physicians, that whole concept of trials being remote, plus the ability to do that care. And I think COVID and the technologies that we now have can really move that forward. And I think certainly vans with FibroScans, if you were to mass scan these people, you could then use dynamic fat fraction, and then you would only need to biopsy potentially the minority of of patients, because you've got a streamlined system using the technology, the NIS4, the ELF, FIB4, any of those mechanisms. But I think the one advantage that Stephen's quite right about, I was talking earlier, is that a lot of our centres seem to be currently open 8 till 8. And I can imagine that they will eventually open 24/7. And therefore we talk about sex workers, people who are rough sleepers, people who are trafficked, people who are abused. They're less likely to engage in the normal healthcare environment. And we certainly have lots of teams that integrate and work very well with those areas of society. And I would like to hope, and I should strongly suspect, that each of those teams has been given a vaccination portfolio to be able to access those people. But I think Piccolo's an excellent type of machine that can do those testings. We can do dry blood spot testing for HIV, hepatitis B and hepatitis C. So all of these opportunities, but they do take resources. And I know we're very limited in resources throughout sort of the main and modern world, and even less so, those resources are available in the low and middle income countries. But I'd say there are opportunities, but I think going back to Manal's initial thoughts, that absolutely can I see ward rounds in the future. Instead of walking between the wards in different hospitals, your portfolio of patients is all over the country rather than more local to you, which all those mini Manals and mini Stephens running around little wards with other teams. Fantastic thought.
Now, I think as we reflect on this, we wear several different hats. As a clinical researcher, my focus was on the potential for drug development, the early evidence of potential improvement in NASH and NASH resolution for some of these emerging therapies. And so there is an impotence and initiative to try and service as many patients with definite NASH as we possibly can. On the flip side of that, we are up against, public health guidances and guidelines for which yet have not potentially fully kept pace in the absence of an approved FDA therapy, have rendered guidance that it may not be cost effective to do population-based wide screening, as we've been talking about, and maybe just to do due diligence and render vigilance for the highest risk cohorts, because should you discover a patient with advanced hepatic fibrosis, certainly that does change clinical care and management and becomes then a cost-effective strategy for screening when dealing with patients who are likely in relatively short order to develop a clinically meaningful outcome, for which there may be early screening surveillance strategies to change the natural course of their disease. So I think we walk a fine line between what both has been rendered by AASLD and EASL guidances for population-based screening versus the hat that we wear when we talk about targeted clinical trials. And I'd be interested in other people's thoughts about this, but ultimately, I do believe that we are going to move more broadly to high-risk screening initiatives, age over 50, diabetes, first-degree family member with liver disease. As a trialist, I certainly want to very broadly screen patients who could potentially benefit from emerging therapies, but I think we are certainly due for, and will see forthcoming in the upcoming year, new societal guidelines. Steve, what are your thoughts about that?
I completely agree with you. There are certainly low-hanging fruit that I think we could more aggressively screen. And I think the hesitancy has been, really analytics to tell us which group is cost-effective to screen. And I think, recent work by Mazen Noureddin's group follows on the work that Kathleen Corey has done in this effort. Both are very well-designed looks at this. And I think some of the more recent data suggesting that the diabetics are a very cost-effective group to screen makes complete sense. And I think we could have predicted that. We just needed the data to support it. And I think that's certainly happening now. And I would be in favor of that. And I hope the new guidance documents reflect that. But whether the guidance documents reflect that or not, it doesn't mean we can't do common sense things. I would be an advocate of beginning to screen these populations that are at increased risk for advanced liver disease. And I would say it's not just the diabetics. I mean, also a strong family history of liver disease would be another one. We all see patients that have a sister, a brother, a mom, or a dad that have liver disease. And Manal, every time you and I see those people, people in our clinic and we say, hey, do you have a family history of liver disease? Oh, yeah. My mother died of liver disease and she didn't drink. Immediately, our spidey senses begin to go up and we think about this patient's being at increased risk. So why aren't we screening those people like they're at increased risk? So absolutely, to your point, I think that's probably an area we move into more aggressively in 2021. And I think there will be some guidance that's forthcoming that would support that.
Stephen and Manal, the two of you started talking, and Stephen, I think you particularly made the point about where would the money come from. So one of the questions I started asking myself was, where would the money come from? And where that pushes me to is a consideration of who is a high-value patient, and a high-value patient where you can identify the person who would pay for that value. So Manal, I think you started on clinical research, actually, when you started talking today in the first place, or shortly after you started. Clinical research would be a high-value patient to the drug company because you want to keep everybody you can in the trial and you want to keep their data as high quality as possible. So that would be a place where if you needed to spend money on building the liver trucks, there might be a faster return.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't see clinical research as just inclusive of industry-sponsored drug trials. We certainly have many ongoing initiatives that are both industry and federally funded studies. And when there are sponsored trials, certainly there brings an element of timelines, case finding, case risk stratification, access, and sponsored studies of any type, I think, put a different twist on how we care for patients and how we continue to propel the mission of academics and science forward despite existing obstacles.
Okay, so that's another source. Same idea obtains, though. I think that's a higher value patient than a typical patient anywhere in America because there's an investment in the trial infrastructure, and the value of the knowledge that winds up exceeding simply the treatment of that patient. So that was one thought I had. Second thought I had was that if diabetics are a good target, what do we know about where diabetics go to get their blood work done? Because if they go to labs, for example, then it might be possible to work something out with a lab where the deliver van shows up on days that have a certain volume of diabetic patients being tested, or maybe they try to organize schedules so the diabetic patients are more likely to be tested at specific days and times, and then you would bring the van there so that you would know that you were getting a lot more use out of creating the van than if you simply were going after random patients. I think in the end, Manal, that isn't where you started, and I think it winds up where you were, which is when we have to go see patients, can we bring the technology to them? And I think it's now portable enough that we can. But if the question is how do you prove out the value of the investment, then it would seem to me that those might be two places to start.
I think they're definitely sort of good pockets to choose, and I think Stephen's regularly said that the low-hanging fruit we know are going to yield the highest percentage of patients who are positive. And I think it's not a case of just randomly screening people. I suppose if we look at cost effectivity in a different way, we're in the middle of a 1 in 100-year pandemic. But one of the things I was going to bring to the meeting tonight was the fact that COVID-19 as an infectious disease, it's a perfect storm because it's been exacerbated by the other pandemic, which are non-communicable diseases, which are one of the world's biggest problems. And I think if we look at cost effectivity of the role of the liver in the cause of these significant non-communicable diseases of the world, which are type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high cholesterol, hypertension, then any screening that we do to target patients, to find those patients for drug trials, to be able to reverse liver fat, to be able to look at lifestyle changes, has got to be way more cost effective than what we're doing at the moment in treating the pandemic that we had warnings of. We've had MERS and we've had MARS, SARS first wave. We knew these were the highest risk patients. We chose to do not a lot about it. Non-communicable diseases are quite rightly now racking up as the world's biggest targets, but it's actually like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. It's a great endeavour, but will we get out of silo health and our own disease areas to actually target multi-diseases in one individual? And I think I can go around and we can have operatives regularly in vans targeting the right people, going to GP practices, areas of health, and I would see it as a mobile operation because you don't want a scanning machine in every centre. That's not cost effective. For the times they sit on the shelf, it's a real problem, certainly for the National Health Service. Most of them collect dust because they're protected by liver units and only liver staff can use them. They don't share with drug and alcohol. So we need to be more collegiate in looking for the right patients. But I think screening and the prevention of diseases has to become, for me, as a wellness person, I don't think people with liver disease should become patients or should suffer illness if they get enough opportunity to make a change, to have the right information and to have the input of Stephen, Manal and all of the experts at an earlier time point. So the resources to me, I think it's a no-brainer with non-communicable diseases driving an infectious disease like COVID-19 that I would hope this is only one in the next 100 years, but if we don't do it correctly, this is just the start.
As I'm listening, I'm thinking of some of the work that Ian Rowe has done and come here and talked about simplifying screening processes, cutting costs, improving patient satisfaction, and identifying more patients. Is that the kind of process that you'd want to put in front of what you're describing?
Absolutely. I think at the moment, when we look at cost effectivity of FibroScan in the NHS, every study that I've seen published talks about FibroScan being £50 or it's X or it's Y. What it doesn't account for is the £750 of different appointments from a GP to the blood test to the specialist hepatologist to then get the referral for the FibroScan. Whereas a lot of those patients we refer straight back because they just have soft fatty livers or they have soft non-fatty livers. That was a £700 to £900 appointment that person didn't need. So bringing it into the right area, not only secondary care but primary care, but also cardiology, health and wellbeing centres. Let people know. Dietetics, if I was a dietitian, I've said it before, why change somebody's diet for diabetes, fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, if you only monitor the blood pressure, the BMI, the muscle and fat layers? Actually, we can now measure internal fat, albeit crudely. It is getting more and more accurate, and people respond extremely well. The engagement of things like FibroScan is high. I did an event not so long ago whereby everybody was competing with each other to get their score down. You just don't get that with a blood test. And that motivation that drives them is very, very vital to the outcomes that you get when you maintain weight loss. And I think those things I've never seen in research and evidence the behavioural change that FibroScan or any form of sort of scan like Sonic Insights is a very visual scan. I think that would have a similar effect. But when people start competing against each other to get their outcome better and drive it down, then you've got engagement in their own health. And I think that is such a key outcome to me, is patients' education and people's education, because I would hope most people don't need to be a patient eventually.
So, Stephen, Manal, how would the kind of thing Louise is talking about work differently in the U.S., where you have maybe more access to equipment but different kinds of demand than in the UK, where simply simplifying the screening process and saving money per test is a tremendously valuable thing for NHS? Let
me just comment on a couple of things that Louise said. And as I'm sitting here reflecting on my patients in clinic, and then I'm thinking back to other tests and what gets people excited. So I don't know. Remember with fatty liver that almost everybody we see is completely asymptomatic. They don't walk into our clinics going, "Doc, I've got fatty liver disease. You're going to have to work me up for that because I feel bad today. I'm fatigued. I'm nauseated. My right upper quadrant area hurts. I feel like my liver is inflamed with fat, and you've got to fix me today because I'm at risk of diabetes and I might progress to liver disease and I might die from it." They don't walk in saying that. They are, for the most part, while patient-reported outcome measures that Zobair Younossi has been a pioneer in leading for NAFLD will suggest, and rightfully so, that these patients have underlying issues at baseline, they've adapted to those underlying issues. And for the most part, when you ask them how they feel, they will not complain. They will not say that there's something that's bothering them. Now, we know there's 10% will have right upper quadrant pain. There's other potential issues linked to fatty liver. There's certainly coexisting medical conditions that are linked to fatty liver. But by and large, until people decompensate, they don't come to the doctor with a liver issue. So just getting a set of liver enzymes, patients in large part are conditioned to get their lipid panel and their kidney panel and their sodium bicarb, potassium, chloride, all that when they go to the doc, and the doc says, hey, everything looks good, you're not anemic, your kidney function's okay, and your lipids are fine. And so when we say, and they also look at their list of liver enzymes often, and what they focus on is what's highlighted in red or what has an H out beside it or what has an L out beside it, and they ask the doctor specifically, what about this lab? It has an H or it's red or it's highlighted. And 9 times out of 10, the doctor will say, that's no big deal, don't worry about it. It could be an erythrocyte count that's slightly elevated. It could be a neutrophil count that's low or slightly elevated, or a lymphocyte count, or something where we don't put a lot of stock into the result. We're not talking about a potassium of 2. We're talking about a potassium of 3.9 that gets flagged as low, and Manal and I are not going to sit there and make a big deal about it. So what happens with liver enzymes is the exact same thing. They'll be flagged maybe as high, and they'll go to the primary care and they'll say, what's up with this? Why is there an H beside my ALT? And the doc's like, yeah, it's just slightly elevated. It's probably nothing. It could be something that you were exposed to. Maybe you had the flu. Maybe it was your statin or something. So let's hold that and check you again in another month or two. And so they're conditioned to not be concerned about it. But imagine a scenario where they're given an image of their liver or a report of an image of their liver, and there's an abnormality. And I say this all the time on the podcast because it's real. I say this in clinic. I go over that with my patient and I say, take this home and put it on your refrigerator as motivation to do the right thing. In other words, eat less, run more, modify your lifestyle, etc. And I think Perspectum designed their multiparametric MRI in the exact same format. Green is good. Red is bad. Orange is pump the brakes, we might have a problem. Because people like to see that. And I can tell you I've done enough multiparametric MRIs to know how much my patients like those color-coded livers. Just like they like seeing a copy of their FibroScan with a CAP and a KPA, and they like to compare when their CAP drops below 280 and their KPA drops below 6. They can look at that and very pragmatically say they've done something good for their liver, despite the fact that they don't feel bad. They understand that there's a problem and they've mitigated that problem or attempted to mitigate the problem. So I think that's a huge opportunity for disease state awareness, to be able to go out into the community and say, do you want to know your liver health? It's cheap, it's free, maybe, and it's readily obtainable, and we can do it in 10 to 12 minutes. And I think the real issue for the panel here today and for the community at large is, how do we affect that from a cost perspective, from a personnel perspective? If we have a van, for instance, that has a piccolo and a FibroScan, that has a coordinator or some tech on, you don't need a tech to do a FibroScan, just somebody that's done enough of them to know what they're doing, and a physician or a physician extender, a nurse practitioner, a PA. If you have all that, how do you get the patients to show up? You can't just, go to the supermarket and park outside and say, hey, come get your liver health checked. I mean, I think there needs to be some link to, maybe an initiative we work through with our patient advocacy groups, the GLI or the Fatty Liver Foundation. We link with our local healthcare authorities where there is COVID vaccination sites to say, hey, how do we get to be a part of this? Does it make sense to you from a public health perspective to do this? If so, what is your interest level in supporting us in this initiative? And maybe there's a cost share there where we can work with our local healthcare authorities. So I don't know, just more thoughts around this whole initiative.
No, and that's an excellent suggestion. And in fact, the British Liver Trust here go around with a van, and they're always fully booked. People just pitch up. And yes, they do go to supermarkets. Yes, they do go to areas us. We had a gastro conference, not last year, the year before. They had a big double-decker bus outside. They scanned over 100 people in Glasgow. People really engage with it. And I did a session for the British Liver Trust because we align with them as well as GLI. And I use a machine, obviously, that has CAP. Now, I referred a third more patients than the other person who just had stiffness. And most of my main referrals were really high fat in people who were pre-diabetic or diabetic, and one had out-and-out cirrhosis on FibroScan. So it was urgent referral to his GP. If they take that information and share it with their GPs, it's absolutely fantastic. But the British Liver Trust go around the country, and they were all sidelined this year. But I think one thing I would like to sort of see with non-communicable diseases in the middle and third world is exactly what you describe. Going around with vans where you can do the testing, you can do the FibroScan. You do not want to biopsy somebody who may be a single parent. Biopsies really in Nigeria, in Africa, in any of those countries are dangerous and risky at the best of times. And I think if the more mobile we can get, the more we can affect. And non-communicable diseases and fatty liver, diabetes affect disproportionately those countries in mortality. So the sort of suggestions that you and Manal have there of being mobile, getting out there with Piccolo, getting the best mobile technology is superb, because the vaccine could be rolled out on these vans as well. If you can FibroScan, you can vaccinate. If you're seeing these patients, you can be doing it all at the same time. It's a potential possibility. But I suppose the other thing is so many vaccinations around the world have been dropped for other diseases. Maybe you could have your all-out health van going around doing that big goal, but there's no reason. It's that mobile and people can engage. And I think it's an excellent suggestion.
You know, when we take a look at other disease states, you know, we started public health screening for lipids, diabetes, blood pressure checks, for example, you know, in public centers. But yeah, each one of these initiatives first requires heightened public awareness and education. Without that, any initiative would fail, because you need the affected population's buy-in to understand that this is important. If I don't decrease my cholesterol, I may have a heart attack. If I don't decrease my blood pressure, I'm going to get heart disease or vascular disease or stroke. And the same applies here. So heightened public awareness is essential. Then cost-effective means by which to deliver the screening intervention. But then it requires an actionable item to be taken. And so if we take a look at mall accesses to the lipid check or the blood pressure check or the glucose check, there is an awareness already of the implications of high cholesterol, diabetes, or high blood pressure on personal health and wellness. And beyond that, there's also an understanding of an actionable item to be taken on that, whether it be lifestyle changes, dietary changes, increased exercise, or therapies if those fail. And the same principles apply here, but I think as a field, as physicians and even as patients, the bridge yet to the public health awareness campaign and education is still not as strong as we see in other chronic disease states. So we're talking here about a deliver van, which is great. We can potentially deliver screening initiatives in a cost-effective manner. But unless it's coupled with an actionable item, structured approaches to rendering a message, not just that you have fatty liver disease, we have to render a message that lifestyle changes could decrease your risk for disease progression, could potentially resolve NAFLD and NASH. Follow up with your doctor. These constructs have to be well thought out, well developed, and on platforms where we are able to connect with patients at risk for liver disease in ways that the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association has connected with them about what we now identify as metabolic drivers for patients with chronic liver disease. But that link needs to be be built. Those building blocks need to be put in place because we can't have one without the other, and they build upon each other. And I still think we're still at base here trying to implement an increased public awareness of fatty liver disease, not just with patients, but also with general providers, rendering cost-effective screening strategies, which I think we certainly can do in reaching out to patients with fiber scans or with piccolo tests. But then we need structured, actionable items to be taken in such a manner that a patient walks away after a screening having an action plan.
And you're absolutely right. And I think a highlight of that obviously was the German press covering fatty liver disease for Christmas, which I thought was interesting. But I heard an advert on the radio last week, which I would have never heard before COVID. And it was an advert for parents to check the barcodes scanner on their phone to check the fat content and sugar content of food that they're feeding their children, because internal fat causes harm. Now, I loved that advert. They didn't say where the internal fat was. It didn't matter. It was the fact on mainstream radio in the UK, for the first time, there is an advert talking about fat in children that you can now scan your barcodes to check the food that you're feeding your children, which I don't think I would have ever heard without the opportunity of COVID or the National Health Service's obesity strategy. So I think we're getting there a little bit further. I would still like them to be overtly inclusive of the liver in some of these adverts, but I'll take it. We're talking about internal fat in children on the radio in the UK in an advert. So it's a start.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a wonderful conversation for sure. And to your point, we have yet to have our first advertisement here in the U.S., about fatty liver or about any kind of abdominal fat relative to foodstuffs or whatnot. In fact, I jokingly kid around that when my son was younger, he would watch football with me on Saturday afternoon, and he knew more about hepatitis C therapy and erectile dysfunction medications than most people, and I think really what is holding us back on disease state awareness in NASH is the fact that we do not have an FDA-approved medication. Because I think the minute we get to that point, there will be a significant commercial interest in getting the word out about fatty liver disease. And we'll see the Saturday afternoon commercials. But without that, it's really hard to deliver the message on such a large enough platform that we get enough penetration into the market to really make a big dent on this. And I think that's really the question, is how do we generate a big enough message that it hits a big enough percentage of the population that it actually is meaningful. What Manal's doing at Duke, what I'm doing in Texas, what you're doing in the UK, ultimately is just a very, very, very tiny fraction of the bigger need. And so how do we force multiply that? That's the real question. And I think it's hard to do without big pharma really helping us with that initiative, or the government, in your case, like in the UK, making that a big initiative as well. So, I think this discussion today has been outstanding in that regard. Manal, do you have any final message to leave our audience with?
I think this upcoming year we're going to be seeing more structured platforms for population-based education, patient education, to build this bridge that we're talking about, such that we can move forward with, well, I know now why it's important, and I should be screened if I'm in a high-risk category, but these wheels are turning. They may feel slow, but they are moving forward. And the identification of the risk of metabolic syndrome and diabetes, patients are starting to connect with. And sometimes now, more than ever, I am having patients come to clinic saying, I have fatty liver disease. I need to be evaluated. I understand this could be important. We are shifting the needle. That is something I never heard of come from my patients 5 years ago. It was me telling them, but now they're coming in with a little bit more insight. And so I think we are going to see these bridges built. in this upcoming year.
Yeah, I think Manal's absolutely correct. I think we're going to move so far forward. And I suppose if I had one wish, it is the NCD agenda that the World Health Organization and the United Nations have. Most governments are signed up to that. But if it doesn't get below a governmental level into mainstream healthcare, then we have an issue. What I would really love to see is an NCD coordinator, either in every hospital or in every region, who can tie in and review and connect with all of these patients with diseases that are connected to cardiovascular, to cancer, the diabetes, the fatty liver, and somebody start to coordinate the care in a multidisciplinary way, because NCDs and the agenda for reducing health mortality is 2030 is coming very quickly from 2020, which will have devastating effects for years, but it's an agenda worldwide, so it should be an agenda locally. So I would really love to see NCD coordinators in a mainstream health environment.
Well, I think that's a terrific way to wrap up today. I'll say a special thanks to Manal for joining us 2 weeks in a row, and Louise for always being on point, ready to go week in, week out, and doing it with a smile late in the evening. So thanks to both of you very much for being a part of this, and I look forward to a better week ahead for Manal and a better year for all of us.
So that's where our session ended. I want to thank Stephen for his superb emergency hosting, and Manal and Louise for their excellent comments and contributions, as well as the specific items Stephen mentioned. I also want to thank our audio engineer, Mike Wilson, who returns from being sick to have to make a good recording out of this mess. Media master par excellence, Eric Rounds, the creative, Polly Lee, Buzzsprout, and all you people who listen and make this worth doing. One more point, as I raised earlier, we'd like to invite all our listeners to follow our new Surfing Nash accounts on social media. Previously, we were posting everything through our Hep Dynamics social media accounts, but we're doubling up just to make sure that nobody misses anything online. So go ahead and follow us at our new Surfing Nash account on social media, comment with questions, or send email to questions@surfingnash.com. And with that, I'm done for the day. Whatever you're doing this week, everybody stay safe, stay positive, do good things, and surf on. We'll see you on the podcast next week. Bye-bye now.
You've been listening to the Surfing the Nash Tsunami podcast. Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website. Thanks for listening. See you next week on the podcast.